Research methods is a toolbox to truth. So unlike some courses where you learn about a lot of content and topics, instead this course is going to be a space where you build skills to do research. So I'm giving you sort of the tools and the toolbox of these skills so that way you can do high quality research and investigate topics or issues or whatever content is relevant to you. So that is why we have this image of a bunch of tools, because the big takeaway of this course is that research methods is a toolbox to truth. So criminology and criminal justice, the two other big major requirements for the criminal justice major, are building on this research methods tool. So whereas criminology is sort of the historical authority on the subject of crime, how crime is made, and learning what the big theories are and the knowledges behind those. Criminal justice, intro to criminal justice, was more about the people, places, practices, the scope of the criminal justice system, how the system works. So we think of institutions and people and what those people do and who's involved. Whereas research methods is the tools to sort of understand and connect this knowledge with these institutions and spaces and places. So what can we say or make generalizations about? And generalizations is like an assumption, a statement that can be true in a given context. And so research helps us figure out what truths persist in different spaces and how the prior knowledge that we've developed historically from theorists of criminology, whether or not what they have said has actually spanned out into the history of being true. So it allows us to both analyze our current state of existing and also understand how historical knowledges can or do not apply to our present moment. I composed this word map cloud diagram, and it may seem overwhelming. There are a lot of jargony sounding words like operationalization, confidence interval, quasi-experiments, random assignment. And while it's good to really get an understanding of each of these words, what I really want you to take away from is overall the general picture of how to set up a research design and how to understand what is high quality research and how you can engage with research in a way that's critical and where you can point to flaws or strengths of the research design and really not just be able to read abstracts and academic articles, but also be able to assess whether or not they're relevant to your particular interests and how rigorous they are. And rigorous, I mean like how much have they reduced bias? How much have they taken the context of the spaces in which they're doing the experiments or the surveys, and whether or not the truth they're claiming their research methods proves actually is supported by the way they went about the research design. So this is going to be the primary focus of our course, is the research process. So we'll get a survey of all the different points in this diagram, and these are the skills that you'll be developing. So theory is usually a big part of the assumptions and principles that we start with in our research. So as criminal justice scholars or people interested in criminal justice, we're familiar with historically who have been the authorities and what they have done. And so criminology is a good base for you to lean on if you're interested in a topic that you don't necessarily know much about or know what the research is. Like, think, how can I apply this theory to this context? Are there any theories that are relevant to this context? And so that can help you sort of develop questions, develop frameworks or types of things you want to look at as you're wanting to implement more of a research design or as you're thinking about someone else's research or paper. So the conceptualization, operationalization will start in the first week talking about, and then we'll move on to population and sampling. And then the rest of the course is really going to be going through each choice of research method. And we'll not be touching on analysis too much or application, but we will get into it at the end of the course a little bit. And now if this diagram is a little overwhelming, I'm going to break it down for you. So now we're focusing specifically on this portion of the diagram, which is conceptualization, operationalization, population, and sampling. And so really what this is in research methods is gathering our raw materials. What are we actually talking about? We're dealing with knowledge, so it's often abstract. So what tangibly can I say is a concept? Okay, so I want to be thinking about juvenile justice. Then what in particular about juvenile justice do I want to focus on? What have other people focused on in juvenile justice as a topic? And am I looking at people or young individuals who are currently incarcerated? Am I looking at people who are high risk to be incarcerated? Am I looking at crime, or am I looking at delinquency? And so these are sort of the things you would ask about yourself. If there's a particular topic or interest that you have, it's like, okay, what are the different concepts and core concepts that have historically framed that? And so it's like gathering, I have three metaphors here for you. So it's like gathering your produce, your ingredients for a recipe, or it's like gathering wood for a building that you're building, or gathering the seeds. And so you're trying to get these concepts and these raw materials all sort of brainstormed out in your head before you go into what your specific question is. Or if you already coming with a specific question, then you need to define what are the concepts and the populations that I'm focusing on. And then we get to the bulk of our course, which is research methods. And there's this long list of experiments, survey research, field research, content analysis. So these are the tools that we apply to these concepts and these populations, this raw material that we're working with. And the tools allow us to understand what trends and patterns come up in these spaces and what we can definitively generalize about. And some tools are good for certain questions and other tools might be bad for those questions. So there are specific tools that are better to use in certain contexts with certain questions, and we'll get into those. So basically you're going to be learning like, okay, if these are the concepts and abstract topics I want to think about, like what's the best tool that I can use to address that question. And then the final product is the observations, analysis, and application. So what's the big takeaway from this whole research design that you've composed, or what's the big takeaway from a research article that you've read? That's sort of the final product, the takeaway that if legislators or criminal justice practitioners were to ask you, okay, what's the best practices, or what can we implement? What is there to learn and move forward with? That's the final product. So in this case, it would be, if we're going with the seed metaphor, then it would be the plant that we get at the end of sowing it and nurturing it, or it would be the final meal that we've made after cooking it, or the building that we've built. And so there are all these different takeaways and assumptions and new findings that we have that get thrown into this big marketplace of research that we all can get access to. And we'll talk about more specifically what the marketplace of research looks like in criminal justice. So this diagram just sort of shows you the process of breaking down that big research process and making it more bite-sized. So it's raw material that we have, whether that be seeds, wood, food, that we then apply tools to, research methods, an experimental design, a survey, are similar to the hammer, the whisk, the measuring cup that we're using to then find a final product. Like, what were the findings? What did we actually observe at the end of it? And that's the takeaways of the research. And because we're dealing with knowledge and we're dealing with abstract ideas and this sort of higher truth, we have to keep our tools separate than our final product. So there's this sort of separation between the design portion and the observations. That's really important, so that way that our preconceived notions and ideas are not influencing what we observe later. So there's this idea that we're supposed to be objective and to find the truth rather than create the truth. And so that is the mode that we'll be thinking in. In other disciplines, it's not in this way, but this is sort of how criminal justice traditionally has been practiced. And there are alternatives, like more grounded theory, that we'll talk about later in the course too. And yes, as I said, the research design portion highlighted here is separated from the observations and analysis and application, because a lot of times there's financial incentives for researchers to create findings where there may not be, like because of political ideology or because they feel pressure from funding to come up with a specific observation. So we really need to be good about separating these two processes. All right, so research is a toolbox, and we'll get into each of these tools and what their strengths and weaknesses are.